All right, so I am joined today by Jason Cross, who reached out to me recently. He's been working on a new, I guess, what would you call it, a new hypermedia framework?
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable description. Yeah.
Maybe a new, I guess, maybe a library. I guess it's semantics on that.
Yeah. I don't know. Some people get really spun up about framework versus library. I'm not as, I don't care, but it's a hypermedia thing. It's a tool for hypermedia enthusiasts. So,
Interesting. So, yeah, this is, I've been kind of, you know, primarily talking about HTMX for a while, but I feel like I've sort of branched out a little bit into different sort of hypermedia approaches because it feels like that's the real, difference between kind of the world of, whatever you want to call it, React and the virtual DOM and stuff versus sort of a
right.
hypermedia approach. So I've been talking to, the creators of Datastar and so you've reached out. This, I guess, is brand new. Is this something that you've been working on for a while, or what's your sort of background in building this stuff?
Yeah. Well, I've been working on it for about a month and a half now. And
Oh, wow.
it's pretty new in that regard. On the other hand, it's building on some old ideas, like a lot of the hypermedia oriented tools that are out there. I feel like it's pretty stable for being so new. From a philosophical standpoint, it's a different approach to hypermedia than, let's contrast it with HTMX, just because that's what your listeners are probably most familiar with. So
Right.
it's different in, it's very similar in some ways. It's sort of one way to think of it is like a very minimalist version of HTMX. Have you seen HTMZ? Have you seen that tool?
I've never looked into it. I've
Okay.
only seen it. I've seen it. What was the description of it? It was like almost like it was a one line like version
Yeah.
of HTMX. Is that actually true, or is that just
Well,
the Twitter version of it?
it's like a lot of software. Like what it is it's a very interesting tool that's very minimal, like very small. I think if you use the real version of it, it's a little bit bigger than the like 123 characters or whatever, but it's very small. And what they do is
But just before you what does that actually mean? What could it do in that
I
small
know.
amount of
Well, so
size?
it's HTMZ, not to make this discussion about HTMZ, but it was an inspiration to an extent for Fixie. So I think it's important to mention it. What they took advantage of is the fact that there's actually already a target attribute on anchor tags and forms. So a lot of people don't know that there is a target, and with that target attribute, you can have a link target an iframe. Now, iframes are pretty limited, sort of in what they can do. And so what HTMZ does is it takes that, basically makes that iframe hidden, and then takes the request response that comes back and then inserts it into the DOM in sort of an HTMX-like way. So it's a very clever hack, or I don't want to say hack in a bad way, but it's
No,
just
we never use
it's a
hack in
very,
a bad way here.
it's a very clever way to take advantage of the existing infrastructure that's there, and then it makes it a very small version of a very small hypermedia tool. It's definitely well worth, anyone who's listening to this podcast should check HTMZ out, because it's again very well done little library. So
Interesting.
Fixie was inspired by that to an extent, and also by HTMX. HTMX has had a lot of success in the last year and a half, 2 years, and so that has made hypermedia more interesting, I think, to people. And so
Right.
I've always, kind of, I don't know, the creator of HTMX is like, he can be annoying, and particularly his online behavior can be a bit immature at times. So,
Right.
I
Not
don't,
for everyone.
not for everyone, exactly. But in fairness to him, he did write a paper on the conceptual ideas of HTMX, where he used this term generalized hypermedia controls. And so what I said is, okay, HTMX it's relatively new for a lot of people, but it's been around for a long time, particularly in the intercooler form before HTMX. And because of that, it has a lot of historical baggage. So HTMX1, you probably know, was Internet Explorer compatible, and so that limited a lot of what could be done with HTMX. And also the philosophy with HTMX, and I think you've mentioned before that you kind of like this, but the philosophy of HTMX is sort of to give you most of what you need. Like it's a fairly complete library. So history support is a good example of something that's not really hypermedia,
Yeah.
but it's necessary for most people or for a lot of
It's
people.
a developer convenience.
Developer
Stuff
convenience
like that.
and things that people just sort of expect to work. And so the HTMX guy decided that he was going to, in order to make HTMX plausible for development, he was going to support that stuff. Fixi, which I've been working on, sort of takes the opposite tack and says, okay, we're going to have the minimal amount of functionality that implements this concept that the HTMX guy sort of outlined called generalized hypermedia controls. So that notion of any event, triggering any type of request and placing it anywhere in the DOM. Let's just really sand that down to a minimal sort of library. Still use attributes to drive the behavior, but take out some of the decisions that lead to HTMX having a larger code base than is absolutely necessary. So Fixi doesn't have like request queuing. It doesn't have that extended selector support stuff that HTMX does, where you can say like next button or whatever. Doesn't have attribute inheritance, which some people complain about in HTMX. Doesn't have history support. Doesn't have CSS transitions, which is actually a big simplification, because Fixi can take advantage of some of the newer APIs. So view transitions is an API, a DOM API that's just come out in like the last couple of years, or the last year really. And that can be used. It's a much simpler API than CSS transitions from an implementation standpoint. And so rather than having a bunch of stuff like HTMX does to make CSS transitions work, we can just omit that and say, here, use view transitions instead. So different flavor, just sort of a different flavor and a different take on a similar idea.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems like you have been kind of, you've familiar with HTMX, HTMZ, been in this kind of space. I mean, just like maybe before we get into some of the details of Fixi, and Fixi is Fixi.
Fixi.
Okay, yeah, I sorry, I didn't get a chance to sort of check it out fully before this, so I was kind of hoping to get into some of the details of it, just if you can. Sure. But so just for some background, like what kind of language, like what language do you work in? What sort of work are you doing? Like what's the what brings you to the sort of hypermedia world?
Well, I do, I do some academic work. I do some social media marketing. A few different. I have a lot of different hats and masks, you might say, that I wear. I've just sort of been involved here and there in this world, and so I saw an opportunity to take the ideas of HTMX and do really a sort of minimalist version of it, because I figured, someone's going to do it. It might as well be me. It also, the project let me, I don't know, do you know Nicholas Worth? Are you familiar with Nicholas Worth? He was a computer. Okay. He's somewhat famous. He's not super famous, but he's a somewhat famous older programmer. He was famous or what he was known for, I should say, was the Oberon and Pascal, the Pascal language. He was one of the
creators of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was very into what he wrote an essay actually called "A Plea for Lean Software," where he sort of lamented how much code goes into modern, and this was written probably 20 years ago when it wasn't nearly as bad as it is today. So
that's funny.
And I've always had a soft spot for that sort of idea, and so I with the Fixi project, one of the big ideas is to like really lean into that lean software idea, to like take Nicholas Worth's plea seriously. And so just as an example, if you go to Fixi doesn't have a website, it's not distributed. It's not distributed via NPM. Instead, there's a GitHub page for it, a README, and the project consists of 3 files. So there's the README, there's fixi.js, and then there's test.html. And so in this project, that's all the files I'm going to allow. Like that's it. Those 3 files are it. And the test.html is entirely self-contained. So there's no dependencies, there's no npm or anything. I just wrote my own testing framework, my sort of hack of a testing framework, so that I could test the software. And I'm not creating a min version, or there's no dist directory or anything like that. It's just those 3 files. So really it was an opportunity for me to take, that idea that I've always loved and sort of explore what that would mean here in the hypermedia world. So
interesting. So this is like the equivalent of if someone were to just like build something like HTMX, but just straight JavaScript written in their, if they were to just build their own file, a single file, and just include it into there. And, this, I guess, like, so I've been talking to some of the other people who I think, Alex Petros, I believe was his last name, contributor to HTMX, and just this kind of concept of fewer dependencies. Something like he's talked about SQLite as these part of this 100-year web service. Like you have a file, you're not doing auto updates to it. You're not pulling in more dependencies. You don't have like this complex chain or tree of dependencies that relies on this. It's just, so you're sort of leaning into that. And because HTMX, I think, still has, you can still access it through NPM, and people talk about the stats of that, like, oh, there's not really that many people doing that, which like, who's doing that is my question. Like, who is doing that? That's the confusing part for me. Sure. But yeah, so it's kind of just casting that aside even, and just saying like, this is a single small file, all you're going to need.
Yeah, very much so. Like, so let's lean into that idea. No dependencies, not even any test dependencies. So HTMX, as you pointed out, it doesn't have any runtime dependencies, so you can just include the file and that's it, and you're good to go. But if you want to test it, it actually relies on some infrastructure to do that. And so with Fixi, a difference between what I did in Fixi and what the HTMX author did is I was like, I'm just going to write my own test framework. And it's not a good test framework, but it's visual. It does what I need it to do. It's not that hard at the end of the day to write a little stupid test framework. So just really leaning into that idea.
Take your word for it.
And then also, and that's one of the things I like about this project is HTMX. I don't know if you've gone and looked at the code, but it's pretty intimidating. It's, a couple thousand lines, I think 5,000 lines. A lot of that is JS docs, so it's kind of unfair to blame the HTMX author for it because he was skeptical of JS doc anyways. But Fixi is, I think 87 or 88 lines of code in total. And
really?
Yeah, so it's written in a way.
I think I just like, so I'll just say I'm not a source diver, and maybe I should be. Maybe it's just, but it's I use tools. But I just have never. I have not done the HTMX one, although I have a plan where I'm basically just gonna like watch the video where the creator of HTMX apparently went through the whole code himself and posted a video of it. So my plan is to watch that video, maybe do a live reaction thing, but I just haven't been able to source dive. But 86 lines, I think I could source dive.
Yeah. Well, and if you watch that video of the HTMX creator as he's going through HTMX, you can hear some exhaustion in his voice because of how much HTMX does, and a lot of that is for very good reasons. But another approach, and it's funny to me because have you ever read grugbrain.dev? Which was written. So that was written
that's kind of what got me started on some of this, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah. And that was written by the HTMX author. And in there, he says, if you want software to be simple, you have to say no. And yet in HTMX, how often did he really say no to things? So in any event, it's a lot of these are very subjective design decisions. I don't want to criticize the guy too much. Like, he had no idea that HTMX was going to get popular.
Well, and I'm kind of the opinion that he's cut too much out. I kind of,
right.
when I talk to him about it, I'm kind of like, I'm of the kitchen sink philosophy.
Right.
Like, not that I think you should complicate tools, but once I'm using them, I always pull in whatever I can, because I'm just like, I don't want to come across something where now I can't do it because I don't have this extension or something.
Sure. Yeah. And so I think that's one area where you're going to, and this is fine. People are allowed to have different opinions on things, but that's one area where you're going to find Fixi probably too minimalist for your tastes. And so maybe, I don't think it sounds like something that's going to appeal to you versus something like HTMX. But there's also people that really like the minimalist vibe. And so, one of the great things about the world is we can have these different takes. And so,
well, I'm curious about, like, so what is, so I've been kind of looking at the essentials of like, I'm building this hype-CP website, and I've been looking at the essentials of HTMX. There's these, you start with, let's say, these 4 things, and I used HX get, HX target, HX trigger, HX swap. Those are kind of this is just personal, my own opinion. Like, with those 4, you can build a lot of different stuff. And I've been trying to figure that out. So I get, I can sort of envision how the minimalist version of this, you add to those essentials a few things. I don't use any of the response headers, the request headers. When it comes to the HTMX, I've learned about them, but I just tend to not use them. So I'm not maybe that far from seeing where the value of something like Fixi comes in, but I am curious, and maybe, where this sort of, like, what is the space that it's fit? Is it really just about hyper minimalism, or is there actually something different? Are you trying to hit, is it just like purely to see that there's more can be done with less? Or are you hitting different features and different abilities with it?
I definitely don't think there's anything that innovative. The ideas in Fixi are taken directly from the paper that the HTMX guy wrote. And in fact, the attributes, so we can go through them really quickly. There's only 5 attributes.
Okay. Only 5 attributes?
Or 6 attributes, but like
6, okay.
five that matter. So there's basically, so if you're familiar with HTMX, there's HX get, and then, you give it a URL or whatever, and then
so do you use HX also? I mean, this seems a
no,
little bit...
No.
Okay.
It's different. We use FX. So HX, FX. So instead of having FX get and then a URL, it's FX action, and then FX method. And so you split out the method from the action. And that's taken from forms, the way that forms work. They have an action and a method. And so that's what that was taken from. And it turns out actually doing it that way simplifies things a lot, because all you have to look for is FX action. So you don't have, the HTMX approach is a little bit denser in the information that it encodes. But Fixi is a little bit simpler in the implementation because it splits those 2 things out. And then...
So if you have those 2, because right now if you do, you've got the 5 things. So you have to have, in HTMX, it's like HX get, HX post, HX... So you've got 5 attributes. So you're automatically simplifying that down to just 2, even just that
down
part.
To 2. Yeah, exactly. So that simplifies things a little bit. It is more code. It is more attributes. I don't know if you want to call attributes code or not, but it is more stuff you have to put on an element if you want to do a non-get, for example.
But very familiar. I mean, because you already have form action, form method. So
exactly.
I get that.
And then there's an FX trigger, which is based on the idea that there should be a triggering event. Which should be very familiar to HTMX users. It doesn't have any of the extended syntax that HTMX has. And it also doesn't have any of the extended events. So, for example, like the revealed event that is used to do infinite scroll and things like that.
Ooh,
That
that's
is
a tough
not
one to
present.
lose.
Yeah, I know. But again, that's the focus of Fixie. The reason it can be 80 some odd lines of code is because we just said we're not going to do that. Now, I do have what I call an extension section in the README where I show how to implement a lot of the features from HTMX in Fixie, but it's additional code that you have to set up the intersection observers and all that stuff. So it's again just a design decision that this is a minimalist implementation of general hypermedia controls, and so we'll make it possible
Right.
to listen for events. But if you want to debounce events, like if you've ever seen the active search example from HTMX, there's code that needs to be written for that, and so that's the downside, I think, of this. And so it's an experiment, and I like it. I like it quite a bit. So I think for things like that, if you can give people a code snippet to copy and paste over, I hope that appeals to the
Yeah.
same people. Obviously, it doesn't appeal to you, but I think the people that this appeals to would be, okay, cool. They're fine writing a little JavaScript to make things work.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, I'm building this hype CP, hypermedia copy and paste. So I'm on board with snippets you can copy and paste and put into your project. So on
Yeah,
that level, I'm good with it.
Yeah, I think is it Shad CN? I think Shad CN is the example from the React world where it's like the most popular React project by like 1,000x or something. And it basically, they just have copy and paste components that are like Tailwinds based. And so
I've never used it, but I've heard so much about it, and I'm like, maybe that's what I'm kind of wanted to try to make is just like this.
Sure.
I haven't used this. I don't really know what it is because I just never use React. But I mean, that sounds perfect.
Yeah, it is. It's and I think that's you can see people love copy and paste. Just copy that, paste it into my system, and it works, and it's great. Like I don't know why we haven't optimized for that in the
Well, I
past.
feel like
But
people have like this, not to get on my own soapbox about this, but people have this kind of like, so I'm a computer science major back in the day, and this sort of don't repeat yourself, copy and paste in my, at some point, I remember it had like a bad reputation in the world of like, if you're copying and pasting too much, you're doing something wrong, don't repeat yourself, try, and this kind of thing. So I feel like and maybe this is not true for most people, but I feel like there's this lingering guilt about copy and paste, which maybe is disappearing now that, Tailwind to me and Tailwind UI, which I use sometimes, like their whole, everything is copy and paste. And so maybe there's not as much anymore, but yeah, I still have that residual, guilt about it.
yeah, but I think again we can point to the success of Tailwinds and Shad CN and these sorts of projects as an indication that from a practical standpoint, it appears that optimizing for copy and paste is a good thing, and so Fixie does that for the extensions. So I try and go through and list here, okay, you want infinite scroll, here's how to copy and paste this in, and then it'll make it work. Or if you want to debounce, copy and paste this in, and it'll make it work, and so forth.
Gotcha.
So that again, that allows me to keep the core of Fixie really tight. So just a couple more attributes really quick. Again, very familiar to your users. So there's also FX target and FX swap. And those are, the values that your users are probably familiar with from HTMX or any, it just uses the standard DOM terminology there, and a CSS selector for target. And then the last attribute is, what is it? FX ignore. I always got to go look. I forget things. Yeah, FX ignore. And so you can put that on an element and Fixie won't process stuff that's inside of it. So you can use that if you want to ensure that there's an area that Fixie isn't available in it. So,
Gotcha. Okay. Huh.
So a lot of ideas sort of, you can see a heavy influence on Fixie from HTMX, but its own take. And really, I think the big idea with Fixie is to focus in on minimalism and this idea of like, okay, if you want more stuff, then here are some copy and paste snippets for you to copy and paste out. And that's what lets me keep the project at only 3 files. and be,
Well, three files, but only it's like one of them is a README, right? And the other one's just
one
like
of,
the HTML test. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, one file, really one file. And in that regard, so one idea with Fixi is that it's going to be really small and included, maybe even so. And this is something people have been talking about. Maybe don't even use minimization on it. So JavaScript minimization is a tool where you take a file and you kind of take out all the white space and comments, and you really destroy the file in a pretty significant way. And that makes it very hard to debug in particular. It makes it hard to debug JavaScript files. There's something called source maps that you can ship along with some source in order to make debugging possible. But then that's another file, and there's, build complex, just that all that stuff gets out of sync, doesn't always work properly, blah, blah, blah. And so Fixi is designed such that it can be just used directly without any minimization. And one thing that's been interesting that I've found is if you look at the Fixi source code, it's written in a very terse manner. But it's also written in a way so that it's easy to debug. And the way to do that, so basically the way to make something easy to debug is to make sure that the major statements are all on an individual line, because then you can set a breakpoint on that line. So it uses some tricks to keep the size down, but at the same time, the source is designed such that it can be debugged. And what's interesting, what I found interesting about that is I've looked into the details of how big Fixi is, and so again, it's 87, 88 lines of code, but the size of Fixi is, let's see, I want to make sure I get this right. Right now is 3,183 bytes, just raw text. So, and a goal of the project is for Fixi to be smaller in uncompressed form than Preact. Have you ever heard of Preact, the Preact library?
I've heard of it, but I can't say
it's a minimal version of React. And the minified compressed version of that is 4.6K, so 4,600 bytes. And so a goal of Fixi, and I think we're pretty much done with it, so it's going to achieve that goal, is to be smaller than in uncompressed form than Preact is in minified and compressed form. So it's very small compared to the vast majority of JavaScript libraries in that regard. And what's interesting to me is when you broadly compress it. So a lot of people know they should use compression for their JavaScript assets. That size drops down to 1,148 bytes. So it really compresses pretty well.
Less than a single kilobyte, I think.
It's getting very close to 1 kilobyte. And what's interesting to me about it is I've done just, on the side, I've done a minification of it and run it through Brotli, and it's only like 900K. So the savings
900B, right?
Bytes, yeah. Well, 900B, 900 bytes. So the savings
I'm not
there,
used to using B, so.
I know. It's cool. It's a cool aspect of the project. But you're talking about a delta of about 150 to 180 bytes between the minified and the unminified version once you start doing Brotli compression. And to me, not having the complexity of a source map and like a junky JavaScript file that you can't read, it's like 100 bytes is worth it. Getting that complexity back. And so again, I don't want to say this project is for everyone, but I think it's been to me, a very interesting, software engineering project, in seeing like, okay, how can we keep the project small, few lines of code, but still useful, but still readable, and especially still debuggable, so that people can feel like I can set a breakpoint and like debug it and see why something is or isn't working. So
yeah, I mean, I find that, like I said, I don't tend to source that, so I'm not usually debugging. It's like if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work or something like that.
Right.
And usually stuff works is what I've found, but. Yeah. I do really appreciate when there's an error and I can see the line. Like, I guess maybe it's the opposite. I really don't like it when something is minified or
Yeah.
compressed. In some way, it's so abstract when you see the error, and it's just like, okay, there's nothing here. There's not even a place for me to start looking in.
Exactly. Yeah, there's an interesting thing. Like the HTMX guy has talked about this with open source. Even things that are sort of GNU, like really ideologically GPL open source, if they have a complicated tool chain to work with, they become implicitly closed sourced because only like wizards who can figure out how to set up the GCC tool chain can work with it. And one of the interesting things about JavaScript is that you don't need anything to write JavaScript except a browser, which everyone has. And so there's an interesting, I think, concept here where if you write small and source that's organized in a certain manner, you can really have an open source project that's truly open source at sort of the visceral level in a way that even more ideological projects might not be. Fixi is BSD 0, so it's basically public domain code anyways, but there's something to be said for smallness and simplicity in software, and what's something that can be useful but is just small enough that anyone can understand it. So maybe a little too philosophical. Maybe, some people, I think, a lot of people, if I'm being honest, I think would probably prefer the HTMX approach that provides a lot more infrastructure. But at the same time, I think Fixi can be an interesting foil to that sort of idea.
Yeah, and I mean, so you mentioned a few other things that, it handles transitions differently too. So using view transitions versus CSS transitions. So, view transitions is something, I guess, like I've seen some very cool demos of this, but it's not something that I've used so much that I have really figured out how to use in my projects, maybe is a better way to say that. So what's the kind of like, how does that sort of work with Fixi?
So basically Fixi, and this is again, because I'm willing to make different decisions than the HTMX person was, like I can say, look, view transitions are the way we're going to handle transitions between one UI state and another UI state. View transitions today are not supported by Firefox, for example. And so Fixi will still work with Firefox, but it's going to be just a boom, boom sort of visual situation in Firefox, whereas CSS transitions do work in Firefox. But again, my focus with Fixi is not on like 100% support and making sure everyone can play and all that. It's just let's take advantage of the APIs that hopefully are coming in Firefox at some point, but and it doesn't really change the user experience that much, but it's just not as nice. And so basically what Fixi does internally, and HTMX does this as well because HTMX supports view transitions as well. It looks and sees, is this API available? And if so, it uses it. Otherwise, it just does the swap sort of directly. As far as like the way you define view transitions is kind of like CSS animations. So it's a familiar sort of mechanism for doing that. The default view transition in Chrome is sort of a fade in, fade out. And so the overall effect of that is if you're using Fixi with Chrome, what you'll see is when you swap in new content, it kind of fades in. Which is nice, and it's a nice touch. They've presumably done studies on like what the timing should be and stuff like that. But you can modify that if you want a more, a different sort of a visual effect.
So let me just, my a little ignorant on how the view trends. So like, do you have to define in your CSS, in your project somewhere that view transitions should be used, and you sort of just, that's like almost like a Boolean flag or something?
No, it's more like kind of like with CSS when you when you have transitions and you put the attribute, you say, okay, here's a class or whatever, an ID.
Yeah.
Transitions is like 1 second ease out star or what, to say like transition all the attributes in some mechanism with a function. It's similar to that. It's a little bit more involved in that there's more animation So it's also there's also the animation stuff you can do. Keyframes, I think, is the terminology in CSS, which I have to admit I'm not a big expert on. So I can't present myself
Yeah,
as
me
an
neither.
expert on how to create view transitions, but there were tutorials. The Chrome team was the sort of instigator of that API, and so they've got some pretty good tutorials on how to do it. But the default one is sort of a fade-in effect, which for 99% of what I want to do is probably fine.
Yeah, okay. So it probably has to like fill the space first and then move the opacity up or something like that. And
Yeah,
probably,
my understanding from the videos that I've watched is they take a snapshot, like a bitmap snapshot of the UI, and then a bitmap snapshot of the new UI, and then you can
oh
define
wow,
functions for the transitions between them. But it's a pretty it's elaborate. But the nice thing
that's
in
pretty
the
cool.
fixie, yeah, the nice thing in the fixie sense is that you don't have to do anything with like to make CSS transitions work. It requires you have to do some crazy stuff. It's one of the reasons
Well,
why
you have to like
HTMX.
know the life cycle of the request and when the stuff has been moved in, right? Like to
Yeah,
do the CSS transition. That's
yeah,
my like vague understanding of it is like, the swap matters, like where it
it
is in the
does
swap process, and you maybe have to go
exactly.
forward a tick or something like that.
Exactly. It's a pretty if you look at I've dug into the HTMX source code before, and the CSS transition
Okay.
support is pretty ugly. It works, but it's and it is a nice API, I think, for people to work with. Like CSS transitions are pretty easy to get your head around, whereas view transitions are more difficult. But at the same time, it just adds a lot of complexity to the HTMX implementation that Fixie, since I'm making different design decisions than he did,
Yeah. Well, I
doesn't
mean,
have
I'm a
the
big,
complexity.
now like I'm basically a convert, I would say, and this is like the Anthony Alaribe who I've talked to on here and who was at, I don't know if you've heard of Big Sky DevCon, but he
Mm,
was there
no.
last year and he was a presenter there. And his, one of his things was just rely on the browser, like lean into the
Right.
browser's getting better and better, lean into
Hmm.
it. And I've like really taken that to heart. And view transitions is one of those things I guess it's like I haven't had the need to really work with it yet, but like I'm pretty
Yeah.
excited about it for reasons like
Yeah.
this. You just
Yep.
move that work to the browser if you can.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think we're seeing more and more. The browsers they're kind of waking up to an extent. So there's a new API called Move Before that just I think shipped in Chrome 133 that allows you to move elements around in the DOM without resetting their state. So if you have, for example, an
Right.
iframe with a video in it, it can be moved from one place to another place in the DOM, and the video will continue playing. And that seems like a small thing, but it really opens up what you can do, what you can achieve with the browser. So I think there's some good stuff coming down the pipe from the browser makers, and I agree. And that's again, if you look at the implementation in Fixie, what you'll see is that it does exactly that. It leans in like, okay, there's a browser API for that now. We're using that. We're not going to try and work around things. We're just going to use the standard API. And if the standard API doesn't do what you want, I don't know what to tell you. Like that's the way the web works. So just different
Right.
approach, different, and different outcomes. So
Yeah, I mean, and probably, I mean, I don't know what your experience maintaining sort of open source projects is, but I can imagine maintaining something smaller like this, if you're willing to say no,
yeah,
which, sounds like maybe you are,
right.
maybe the maintenance is easier.
Yeah. Yeah,
Are you
I
work?
think so. I think so.
Okay. Are you working with other people, sort of collaborating right now, or is this sort of your own personal project?
It started off as me just doing it myself, and then a couple other people have made contributions to it. But it's so small, it's not
Right.
really, it's just not even really, it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about. And I think it's pretty close to being done. The
Okay.
HTMX people, I don't know if you saw, they wrote an essay saying HTMX is pretty much done, like as
I
far
did
as
see that. Yeah, yeah.
And
Which is
this
cool.
appears, which is cool, right? It's just a tool. It does a thing. And this is, I think, even more so than that, going to be in a position where, because it's more ideological about the lean software approach of Nicholas Worth, I think we can, put a fork in it and be like, okay, here's some code, and you can look at it, you can modify it. So, just as an example, Fixi doesn't support attribute inheritance. So I don't know how much you've
Attribute
used attribute.
inheritance. Okay.
So that's where you can put an
Interesting.
attribute on a parent, and then the children will get it. So if you put, like, for example, ajax target on a parent, then all the sub elements will have the same target from the parent.
Which sometimes is a
And
little confusing, honestly.
yeah,
It
people
can
complain
be.
about it. People complain about it at times because you can have, it's funny that, again, the HTMX guy, who can make any sense of this dude? He goes out and he writes an essay called Locality of Behavior, where he advocates explicitly, like, put the behavior on the element. And then he goes and creates HTMX, and it has attribute inheritance, which can move the behavior away from the element. Like, well, what is it, guy? Like, what, you're
Yeah,
just
that's interesting. I never really
just
thought about that.
yeah, like, what, you just saying random stuff on the internet to, like, make people laugh or something? It's ridiculous. So anyway, this is why I think sometimes it's a little hard to take HTMX too seriously. But with Fixi, okay, we don't have attribute inheritance, but there are people that like it, and there are reasons for it as well. So to take the other side of that coin, it kind of sucks if you got 5 things that are targeting the same element, and you have to put a target specifically on each of them, right? Like, that kind of stinks.
Right.
So rather than providing that functionality in Fixi, there's in the extension section, I actually show the line of code and say, just change this line of code from this to this, and then you'll have attribute inheritance.
So you mean
So,
like change the original
like,
file?
modify the library,
Okay, now
right?
we're getting to a new territory here.
Yeah, no,
So this
and
is
that's
not exactly an extension.
not exactly an extension, a little bit a modification, but I want the Fixie code to be so simple that if you don't like it, you can fork it and do something like that if you want. And I think it's plausible in a way that wouldn't be plausible if you look at the HTMX code base, for example. So again, just a
Right.
different flavor. I don't want to say right or wrong. It's software engineering, so there are trade-offs here, but Fixie's picking some different ones than HTMX did for sure.
Yeah. So I guess, like, if you don't, if you like, what would it look like to, you said, so you're, let's say you're missing some things. You're used to using something like HTMX. You don't have
Right.
your, what was the example you gave? The
Infinite scroll.
reveal. Yeah, infinite
Yeah.
scroll. Like, so
Right.
you don't have the same list of triggers, I guess, is part of
Right.
it. So maybe even, what about load? Is that one included? That's one I use on a regular basis.
Load is not included. There is an event, however, that is triggered FX init. And so that can kind of stand in for load. So there's what
Okay.
are so you can, there's 9 events in total that are fired, which is far fewer than HTMX. HTMX triggers a lot of events too, is my understanding. And so I really here tried to focus in on minimizing the number of events and maximizing their usefulness. And so you can use the FX init method kind of in a way that you would use load for example. So it's doable
Okay.
for, like, and there I have if you go through the extensions part of the README, I have a lot of the examples from the HTMX. I've noticed a lot of competitors to HTMX do this. They take the HTMX examples and then do their own versions of it. And so I'm following that sort of trend of
Gotcha.
taking
Yep. I
those
know
examples.
Datastar sort of has a compare and contrast kind of idea
Yeah,
there as well.
yeah, and I think HTMZ does it as
Oh,
well.
HTMZ
So
probably. Okay. Yeah, I gotta
yeah,
check that out. It still seems
yeah, you
unreal.
should, I have to say the HTMX guy, he does have an essay up called Alternatives. So if you go to the HTMX org/essay/alternatives page, and it mentions Fixie, and he seems pretty
Oh,
open to
wow. Okay.
other. He seems pretty open to other sort of projects that
Well, I was
use
kind
the
of like
hypermedia
wondering about
approach.
that because, I don't want to, you know, you have your own project it's kind of clear that it's inspired by HTMX.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know how do I guess I wonder what someone like Carson Gross would feel. Does this feel? I know it's open source, so anybody can look at HTMX and copy it. I don't know
Yeah.
how he might feel about something like this. Like I know that
Yeah.
he kind of maybe. I think people sort of know, he took some of the ideas from an earlier project, Intercooler, which
Right.
I don't know that much
Yeah.
about, but so maybe he's not
Right.
really one to complain about it. But I don't know. Do you feel like
Yeah.
he would sort of accept? I guess if you put it on the HTMX site already,
Yeah.
maybe it's
I, you
okay.
know, I'd say two things. First of all, it looks like he's not super hung up on that stuff. But if he is, he made it open source. He made it BSD zero. Like he wrote a paper on the thing. Like, what are you going to do, buddy? Like, come at me, bro. Like,
Yeah.
it is what it is. Fixie's a different approach. And if that upsets him, then maybe that's a good thing. Maybe he needs to think about why that would upset him.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the world of software can be cutthroat, I mean, if
Very
not,
cutthroat.
not that you're being cutthroat. I'm just saying like this,
Yeah.
people have their
No,
own take on stuff and that's fine.
yeah, it is, and it's serious too. That's the other thing. This is one again something that bothers me about the HTMX sort of like just general feel at times is like hypermedia is a good idea, and this guy just sometimes acts like such a buffoon. It's like you're
So I don't want to. Yeah, I mean, like I appreciate the online presence. So
okay.
I just want to
Okay,
be clear.
yeah,
I was brought in by the Grug brain stuff.
sure.
So if people can have some fun with software, I know maybe that's not sort of your thing, but
No,
I think there's a case to be made for kind of
yeah.
having some fun with even with hypermedia.
Yeah, I just think a little bit more seriousness would help him in general in his life. Not just
No,
like
I can.
software, but like just in general.
I see.
Anyways,
I know. I see
we're
what you're
getting
saying.
I don't know the guy very well, so I don't want to say too much about him.
Yeah. All right, so maybe just the last thing, just because I do like I know we're not sharing code here, and
Right.
because I'd like to keep it kind of so that people can hear it and listen to it, but
Sure.
maybe could you walk me through the process of adding something like a reveal? So are you
Right.
writing JavaScript or are you said you can copy and paste, but like
Yeah.
what's the language? I assume JavaScript, but what's the sort of format look like? Are you extending something? Are you
Yeah. So the recommended approach is first of all to download the fixi.js file and embed it in your project. So it's not available via npm. So it shouldn't be part of a build step. Instead, it should be copied and potentially even pasted directly into a script tag in the head of your document. If
yeah.
you have a single HTML document, just put it in the head because you can copy and paste it there, and that's be very fast. You can't. There is a link in the README that shows how to use JS Deliver, the CDN that uses
Oh, so you
GitHub
have it's up on a CDN as
tags.
well?
Yeah, so you can use that to if you want to if you want to just use it directly without having to host it or anything like that. But I think it's definitely geared towards what's called vendoring, where you just download the file and there's a curl script that you can copy and paste to actually do that in the README. So that's the installation mechanism. Very different than HTMX and most JavaScript libraries in that regard. And then if you want to do something like, let's see here, let me find infinite scroll. If you want to do infinite scroll, in the extensions, there's an intersections event section, and there's just maybe 20 lines, 15 lines of JavaScript code, and you copy that and then you paste it into another JavaScript file. And so we recommend, but don't require that if you're going to have extensions, you have fixi-x.js that lives next to the fixi.js library,
Gotcha.
and then you just copy that. And one of the nice things about GitHub is that they have a little copy button if you do a code block, and so you just copy that little bit of
That's
JavaScript
cool.
out, and it sets up some event listeners for you, and like whatever. Like you don't have to worry too much about the details, but you just paste that into your extensions file, and then once you do that, then you can. There's an example just below it, and it looks very similar to to HTMX. So your FX trigger becomes intersect. So that JavaScript code that you copy and paste in is there to start triggering the intersect event. It doesn't ship by default with Fixi, but it's very easy to add it. And again, the idea here is that you have ownership over that code. So if you want the behavior to be different in some way, then you can modify that code yourself or extend it or whatever. It's very, again, I don't know how, who knows? I didn't expect it, or Carson Gross, I bet, didn't expect HTMX to become popular, but it did. And this is a different idea. And so I don't know if this is going to be popular or not, but I thought it would be an interesting experiment.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like the appeal, it might, first of all, just the philosophical, bare bones, minimal appeal.
Right.
You might come down to how comfortable people are writing JavaScript.
Yes.
If you're close to the code and you're used to writing maybe vanilla JavaScript as your own way of already doing stuff, this might feel pretty natural to add an extension in vanilla in JavaScript.
Yeah.
If you use HTMX or something like that for the purposes of never writing a line of JavaScript again, and you're kind of, pulling in, I don't know, Hyperscript or Alpine to kind of,
Right.
Obfuscate the JavaScript world a little bit more, then, this might be a little too close to the JavaScript. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. People who are comfortable with vanilla JavaScript and are also hypermedia enthusiasts, I think, would really enjoy
Interesting.
Fixi. So
I'm getting a little more comfortable with vanilla JavaScript, I will say,
Yeah.
because I found it works nicely with LLMs to
Sure.
just tell it, give me an inline implementation of this thing I want to do. And it's like,
Interesting.
it's just putting this like JavaScript into my inline. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, that's good enough. Like, that's perfect.
Yeah.
It's got the locality of behavior. Yes, if I did that like with everything, it would probably be too messy for me to understand. But for
Right.
every now and then, for instance, what you just said, a copy this snippet of code. I just have these like inline on click copy things all over, where I just like, I figured out a way to do that inline pure JavaScript, and
Right.
it's kind of nice.
It is. And that's I'm sympathetic to people that bag on JavaScript. I went through an anti-JavaScript phase in my life as well. And there's plenty wrong with it, but it is there in the browser and it isn't horrible. And the APIs and the DOM can sometimes be a little obscure, but they're there for the most part. And so I think learning some vanilla JavaScript, if you're going to be a good web developer, you should probably like put some time in learning it. That doesn't mean you've got to take the like React, like JavaScript maximalism approach to life. Not that that's always wrong, but learning a little bit of JavaScript can go a long way. It is a language that has very, and like I said, there's an aspect to JavaScript that is open source in a way that even ideological projects like the GNU utilities aren't able to be open source, because it's just text that's right there. It's an interpreted language. Everyone has a VM that requires no compilation or complicated tool chain. Like, you can just start writing code. There's something very magical about that. And so I think it's it's one reason why I'm a little bit down on things like TypeScript, because it forces this sort of like tool chain Java style, C# style of development onto people. And like, maybe that's better in some ways. It's for sure better in many ways, but it also has drawbacks that I think sometimes the advocates of those tools don't acknowledge. There's something about the immediacy of vanilla JavaScript that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely. To me, I think where I'm starting to draw the line now that things are kind of like coalescing in my head a little bit around, I've been working on this, working in a hypermedia kind of approach for a while, is like, once we get to the virtual DOM, that's where I start to say like, you know what, now I feel like we're losing some of our superpowers by moving things to the you get new superpowers. That's fine. Like, you you gain some things, but you were actually losing quite a bit. That's just my opinion on some of this. So
Yeah.
keeping it in vanilla JavaScript sort of also keeps it in the DOM most of the time.
Yep.
I mean,
Yeah, I agree.
All right. So yeah, I mean, anything else you want to sort of, if there's any other sort of work that you've, done, or anything else you sort of want to add on Fixi that we haven't covered?
No, there's no other work. I think it's just, just wanted to do something a little bit different from what I saw what was going on. And I appreciate you, taking an email from me, just a random stranger to come on and talk about it. So I know it's a little
No,
bit
I'm happy
different
to.
and
It's a super
might
cool
not.
project. I think it's hard to put yourself out there sometimes, and
Yeah.
put a project out. And I really appreciate. I've never done it, and I someday hope to. But I just
Yeah.
think it's cool. So I'm happy to kind of give you whatever
Yeah.
whatever little sort of platform I have. Happy to share that with
Well, yeah, cool. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks a bunch.
you. Yep. Thank you. Have a great one,
Okay.
Jason.
Yep.
All right.
See ya.
See ya.